China is building a military advantage inside the war it is not fighting, and almost no one is explaining what that actually means. That is the headline. China is building a military base inside Iran. That is the story you were told. Here is what is actually happening. What is being constructed is not a traditional base in the way most people imagine it. It is an information position, a vantage point, a data collection architecture embedded inside an active conflict involving the United States. Before I go further, I want to know where you are watching this from and what your structural reading of this is. Put it in the comments, and stay until the end, because the data point I share in the final report changes how this entire story reads. Let me be precise about this. In April 2026, strategic assessments confirmed that China has been using the Iran war as a live operational laboratory. Not symbolically, not politically, operationally. Every engagement between United States forces and Iranian systems is being observed, recorded, and analyzed by Chinese military planners. This is not what most people think it is. The common framing is that China is supporting Iran, that it is aligned with Tehran in opposition to Washington, that this is another proxy alignment in a larger geopolitical contest. That framing is incomplete. China is not entering this war as a participant, it is entering as a collector. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. Consider what is actually being observed. United States carrier strike groups operating in contested waters, stealth aircraft conducting sorties, electronic warfare systems being deployed in real conditions, logistics chains sustaining high-tempo operations over a 6-week campaign. These are not theoretical systems anymore. They are being used under pressure against an adversary that is actively attempting to disrupt them, and China is watching all of it. Today's battlefield is tomorrow's textbook. Now add a second layer. China supplied Iran with specific systems before the conflict began. The YLC-8B anti-stealth radar. This is not a generic transfer. This is a system designed to detect aircraft that are specifically engineered not to be detected. Now that system is being used against actual United States stealth aircraft. Think carefully about what that means. In exercises, performance is modeled. In simulations, assumptions are made. In controlled environments, variables are limited. But in a real conflict, none of those constraints apply. The radar either tracks the aircraft or it does not. The aircraft either evades detection or it does not. And China is receiving that data. There is no substitute for real-world performance data. At the same time, there are reports, confirmed through Reuters, that Iran is nearing acquisition of 50 CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missiles from China. These are not defensive systems. These are designed to target aircraft carriers. So now consider the full structure. A Chinese-designed missile, potentially deployed by Iran, against a United States carrier strike group in an active conflict environment. Even if no missile is fired, the preparation alone generates data, targeting patterns, detection responses, electronic countermeasures, intercept readiness. And if a missile is fired, the data expands exponentially. Every engagement produces more information than intention. This is not accidental. This is structured observation. And this is the part of the story that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. The Iran war, in structural terms, is functioning in 4 simultaneous ways. It is a direct conflict between the United States and Iran. It is an intelligence collection operation for China. It is a weapons testing environment for Chinese systems. And it is a doctrine development platform for a future scenario that is not located in the Middle East. It is located in East Asia, specifically Taiwan. Let me be very precise about this. The systems being observed, the tactics being recorded, the responses being analyzed, these are not abstract interests. They are directly relevant to a potential future conflict involving United States forces in the Western Pacific. And this is where the central analytical question emerges. If China is learning from every United States move in this conflict, in real time, under real conditions, what does that mean for the next conflict where those same systems will be deployed? Strategy is always clearer in the archive than in the moment. The question is not whether China is involved. The question is what kind of involvement this actually is. And that is the question we now need to answer. To understand why China is doing this, you have to separate perception from structure. Washington reads this as indirect alignment with Iran, a form of strategic positioning against United States influence in the region. Beijing does not describe it that way. Beijing is not entering the conflict, it is observing it. Both readings follow internal logic. Let me be very precise about this. The People's Liberation Army is not learning about Iran, it is learning about the United States. That distinction is essential. This is not new. Militaries have always studied wars they are not directly fighting. The United States did this during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. The Soviet Union did this during Vietnam. Observing adversary performance under real conditions has always been one of the most valuable sources of military knowledge. But what makes this case different is the density of data and the specificity of the target. China is not observing broadly. It is observing with a defined future scenario in mind. Taiwan. The future battlefield is studied in someone else's war. Now consider the United States position. Carrier strike groups deployed, stealth aircraft conducting missions, electronic warfare systems active, logistics chains stretched across long distances. These are the core components of American power projection. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. Washington sees these operations as demonstrations of strength, signals of deterrence, proof of capability. Beijing sees them as exposure. Every sortie reveals patterns, flight profiles, timing sequences, support dependencies. Every electronic warfare deployment reveals frequencies, responses, and adaptation limits. Every logistics chain reveals vulnerabilities in sustainment. Visibility is not neutral. It is a form of disclosure. Now bring Iran into the structure. Iran is not simply a passive battlefield. It is an active participant, deploying systems, including those supplied by China. The YLC-8B anti-stealth radar is now interacting with real United States stealth aircraft. Not in controlled testing, not in simulation, in operational conditions. This produces a category of data that cannot be replicated. Detection ranges, tracking consistency, environmental interference, countermeasure effectiveness. Each of these variables feeds directly into Chinese military planning. And this is the part of the story that almost no one is explaining accurately. The CM-302 missile introduces a second layer. A supersonic anti-ship system designed for one primary purpose, targeting high-value naval assets such as aircraft carriers. Now consider the logic. If Iran acquires 50 of these missiles, as reported, and integrates them into its operational planning, then any attempt to deploy or even signal deployment generates data. How targeting solutions are developed, how launch platforms are positioned, how United States naval defenses respond. Even the absence of engagement is informative. A system reveals itself most clearly when it prepares to act. Now we reach the two-thirds point of this analysis, and this is where the most clarifying data point emerges. 6 weeks. That is the duration of the campaign referenced in the assessments. 6 weeks of continuous operational activity involving United States forces. 6 weeks is not a short window. It is long enough to observe patterns stabilize, to distinguish between initial deployment behavior and sustained operational behavior. In military analysis, that distinction is critical. Early actions can be improvisational. Sustained actions reveal doctrine, and doctrine is what China is studying. Patterns, not incidents, define capability. Now step back and examine Beijing's calculation. China does not need to risk its own forces to gather this data. It does not need to initiate a conflict. It does not need to escalate. The data is being generated anyway. This is what makes this structurally efficient. Low cost, high information yield, no direct exposure. From Beijing's perspective, this is an optimal learning environment. Now consider Washington's position again. The United States is conducting operations based on immediate objectives, managing a live conflict, responding to threats, maintaining deterrence. It is not optimizing for being observed. And this creates an asymmetry. One side is acting, the other side is learning. Miscalculation requires no malice, only two different definitions of acceptable risk. Let me be precise about the structural implication. If China is refining its anti-carrier doctrine using data derived from how United States carrier strike groups operate under pressure, then the next time those carriers are deployed in a different theater, they are no longer facing a theoretical adversary. They are facing an adversary that has studied them under real conditions. If China is refining its understanding of stealth aircraft performance based on how those aircraft behave when tracked by systems like the YLC-8B, then future encounters are not based on assumptions. They are based on evidence. And if China is analyzing electronic warfare interactions in this environment, then it is not just understanding capabilities, it is understanding limits. Capability matters. Limitation decides outcomes. This was not a surprise. The trajectory was visible. The question now is not what China is doing. The question is what this accumulation of knowledge produces over time. And that brings us to the structural conclusion. The Iran war is not only shaping the balance of power in the Middle East, it is altering the informational balance of power between China and the United States. That is the structural fact. Let me be precise about this. China has gained access to a category of military data that is normally only available through direct conflict with a peer adversary. It has done so without deploying its own forces, without accepting battlefield risk, and without triggering escalation in its primary theater of concern. This is not what most people think it is. The common assumption is that military advantage is built through investment, training, and technological development. That is correct, but incomplete. Advantage is also built through observation, through pattern recognition, through the accumulation of real-world performance data that reveals not just what a system can do, but how it actually behaves under pressure. China now has that data. Knowledge gained without risk is strategically disproportionate. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. This does not mean China is now dominant. It does not mean the United States has lost its military edge. That is not what the evidence shows. What it means is more precise. The uncertainty that previously existed in Chinese military planning, particularly regarding United States operational behavior, has been reduced. And in strategic terms, reducing uncertainty is one of the most valuable gains a military can achieve. War is shaped as much by what is known as by what is possessed. Now consider the longer arc. This is not the first time a rising power has learned from a conflict it did not fight. History is full of these moments. The difference here is the technological density of the systems being observed and the specificity of the future scenario those observations are being applied to. Taiwan is not an abstract contingency in Beijing's planning. It is a defined scenario with defined operational challenges. United States carrier strike groups, stealth aircraft, integrated logistics, electronic warfare. Every one of those elements has now been observed in a real conflict environment. And this is the part of the story that almost no one is explaining accurately. The value of this data is not immediate. It does not translate into instant capability. It translates into refinement. Refinement of doctrine, refinement of targeting, refinement of countermeasures, refinement of timing. These are incremental changes, but in military systems, incremental changes accumulate. Small adjustments repeated over time redefine outcomes. Let me be very precise about this. If Chinese planners now understand how long a United States carrier strike group can sustain high-tempo operations before requiring logistical adjustment, that affects timing calculations. If they understand how stealth aircraft alter their behavior when tracked by systems like the YLC-8B, that affects detection and engagement planning. If they understand how electronic warfare systems are deployed and adapted in real time, that affects countermeasure design. Each of these is a marginal gain. Together they form a structural shift. Advantage rarely arrives as a breakthrough. It accumulates as clarity. Now consider the United States' position within this structure. Washington did not design this conflict to be observed. It is operating to achieve immediate objectives. But in doing so, it is revealing patterns that can be studied, archived, and integrated into an adversary's planning process. This is not a failure. It is a structural condition of operating in a world where observation is constant and data extraction is continuous. The act of deployment is also an act of disclosure. And this is where the broader implication emerges. The next time the United States and China face each other in a crisis, whether in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere, one side will be operating with a deeper empirical understanding of the other's systems under real conditions. Not perfect understanding, not complete certainty, but reduced ambiguity. And reduced ambiguity changes decision-making. Miscalculation becomes more likely when confidence increases asymmetrically. This was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions and structural conditions. A conflict in one region, advanced systems deployed, external observation enabled, data collected over time. Now step back one final time. The Iran war is not only a regional conflict. It is part of a larger strategic environment in which actions in one theater generate consequences in another. China has treated this environment as an opportunity to learn. The United States has treated it as an operational necessity. Both positions follow internal logic, but they produce different outcomes. Structural forces do not require bad intentions to produce bad outcomes. The evidence shows this clearly. China is not building a military base inside Iran in the traditional sense. It is building something more consequential, an archive, a data set, a body of knowledge derived from real-world interaction with the most advanced military systems the United States possesses. And that knowledge does not remain static. It is studied, integrated, applied. Think carefully about what that means.